The image is etched into the collective memory of the 20th century. Lee Kuan Yew, the founding father of Singapore, weeping on national television on August 9, 1965. The world saw a broken man, a politician mourning the death of his dream of a unified Malaysia. But behind the tears and the emotional rhetoric lay a cold, terrifying calculation that the cameras did not capture. Lee Kuan Yew was not just sad, he was terrified. In that moment of independence, which was thrust upon him against his will, he realized that his newborn nation was not merely an orphan, it was a target. Singapore had been expelled into a world that did not want it to survive, and it was entirely naked. The geopolitical map was the stuff of nightmares. To the north lay Malaysia, the very country that had just cast Singapore out, driven by a Malay nationalist agenda that viewed the Chinese-majority island with deep suspicion and barely concealed hostility. To the south lay Indonesia, a giant of over 100 million people under President Sukarno, who was actively waging an undeclared war known as Konfrontasi, sending saboteurs to plant bombs in Singapore's streets. Lee Kuan Yew looked at the map and saw a tiny red dot surrounded by a sea of over 100 million Muslims, many of whom regarded the existence of a Chinese commercial hub in their midst as a historical aberration that needed to be corrected. The immediate reality was even grimmer than the map suggested. For over a century, the security of the island had been guaranteed by the British Empire. But the empire was in retreat, its economy shattered by 2 world wars, its appetite for overseas adventures gone. The British had made it clear they were going home, east of Suez. The security umbrella that had shielded Singapore was closing, and once the last British warship left the harbour, there would be nothing standing between the island and its predatory neighbours. Lee Kuan Yew retreated to his office, wiped his eyes, and demanded to see the inventory of his own defence forces. What he found was not an army, but a death sentence. On paper, Singapore possessed 2 infantry battalions, the 1st and 2nd Singapore Infantry Regiments. In reality, these units were a Trojan horse waiting to open the gates from the inside. The composition of these battalions was a strategic catastrophe. Composed primarily of soldiers recruited during the colonial era, the ranks were over 70% Malay, many of whom were not even born in Singapore, but in the kampongs of Malaya. Their officers were Malays. Their loyalty was not to the flag of the new Republic of Singapore, but to the King of Malaysia and the concept of Malay supremacy. Lee Kuan Yew realized with a jolt of horror that if a conflict broke out between Singapore and Malaysia, a scenario that seemed imminent, his own army would likely turn their guns on his government. He was a prime minister without a sword, sitting in a room guarded by men who potentially viewed him as an enemy. The police force was in a similar state of disarray, demoralized and ethnically divided. If the racial riots that had plagued the city in previous years were to ignite again, Lee knew he could not count on his own security forces to restore order. The state was hollow. It had a flag, an anthem, and a seat at the United Nations, but it had no capacity to enforce its will or defend its borders. In this atmosphere of existential dread, Lee Kuan Yew summoned the one man he trusted with his life and the life of the nation, Goh Keng Swee. Goh was the architect of Singapore's economic miracle, a man of brilliant intellect and steely pragmatism. Lee handed him the poison chalice. He appointed Goh as the Minister of Defence and gave him a directive that was as simple as it was impossible. Build an army, do it from scratch, and do it now. There was no time for a 5-year plan. The British withdrawal was accelerating. The threats from Jakarta and Kuala Lumpur were growing louder. The directive was clear. Singapore needed a military force that could deter an invasion, or at the very least make the conquest of the island so bloody and painful that the aggressor would think twice. They needed to transform a population of traders, coolies and clerks, a society that culturally despised soldiering, into a fighting force capable of standing toe-to-toe with the battle-hardened guerrillas of Indonesia. And they had to do it before the predators realized just how defenseless the prey really was. Goh Keng Swee wasted no time. He knew that Singapore lacked the expertise to train a modern army. They needed teachers, they needed a doctrine, and they needed it immediately. He began to send out desperate cables to the world, pleading for assistance. The logical choice was the British, but London was washing its hands of the region. They agreed to leave some equipment, but refused to train an offensive force that might drag them back into a regional war. Desperate, Go turned to the great non-aligned powers. He wrote to Lal Bahadur Shastri, the Prime Minister of India, asking for military advisors. India, wary of upsetting its relations with Malaysia and the broader Muslim world, politely declined. He reached out to Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, the hero of the Arab world, hoping for solidarity among post-colonial nations. Nasser, too, turned his back, unwilling to support a Chinese state against his Muslim brothers in Malaysia and Indonesia. The silence from the international community was deafening. It was a harsh lesson in the realities of realpolitik. Singapore was alone. No one was coming to save them. The world expected the island to fail, to collapse under the weight of its own vulnerability and crawl back to Malaysia on its knees. But amidst the rejection letters and the diplomatic cold shoulders, there was one option left. A nuclear option that was so dangerous, so politically radioactive, that merely whispering it could cause the government to fall. Lee Kuan Yew and Goh Keng Swee knew of one other small nation, surrounded by hostile neighbors, outnumbered and outgunned, that had managed to survive against all odds. A nation that had turned a population of refugees into the most feared military machine in its region, Israel. It was a choice that defied all political logic. If the Muslims of Malaysia and Indonesia, or indeed the Muslims within Singapore itself, discovered that Lee Kuan Yew was inviting the Zionists into the heart of the Malay archipelago, the backlash would be apocalyptic. It could trigger a jihad. It could cause the very invasion they were trying to prevent. But as the sun set on the first days of independence, with the British packing their bags and the enemy at the gates, Lee Kuan Yew realized he had the freedom of the desperate. He looked at Goh Keng Swee and gave the nod. They would reach out to Tel Aviv. They would invite the Israelis in. But they would have to do it in total, absolute secrecy, burying the truth under layers of deception so deep that not even their own citizens would know who was teaching them how to kill. The ink was barely dry on the Independence Proclamation of August 1965, when the new government of Singapore began a frantic diplomatic offensive that was, in reality, a desperate plea for survival. Lee Kuan Yew and his defense minister, Goh Keng Swee, were under no illusions about their predicament. They knew that building an army from scratch required more than just rifles and boots. It required a doctrine, a structure, and a training philosophy that could turn civilians into soldiers in a matter of months. They needed a mentor nation, a big brother to guide them through the infancy of statehood. But as they looked outward, they found that the world was a cold and indifferent place for a small Chinese-majority island adrift in a volatile Malay sea. The first instinct of the Singaporean leadership was to turn to the acceptable powers, nations that were politically safe and diplomatically palatable to their neighbors. They looked to the leaders of the non-aligned movement, hoping that the solidarity of the Third World would translate into tangible military aid. The first letter was drafted to New Delhi, addressed to Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri of India. On paper, India was the perfect partner. It was a massive Asian democracy, a member of the Commonwealth, and a nation with a vast, experienced military tradition inherited from the British. Moreover, Singapore had a significant Indian population. Lee Kuan Yew hoped that India would see a strategic advantage in having a friendly, stable partner at the mouth of the Malacca Strait. But the reply from New Delhi was a polite but firm refusal. The Indian government was locked in its own existential struggle with Pakistan and was deeply concerned about maintaining cordial relations with the Muslim world. They calculated that aiding a Chinese Singapore would antagonize Malaysia and Indonesia, potentially pushing those nations closer to Pakistan. The Indian vision was focused on their own borders. They had no appetite for an adventure in Southeast Asia. For Lee, it was a stinging rejection. The great Asian giant had looked at the drowning island and decided it wasn't worth the risk of getting wet. Undeterred by the rebuke from India, Lee and Goh turned their eyes toward Cairo and Gamal Abdel Nasser. In the 1960s, Nasser was not just the president of Egypt, he was the titan of the Arab world and a towering figure in the global anti-colonial struggle. Lee Kuan Yew respected Nasser's secular modernization of Egypt and hoped that a connection could be forged on the basis of post-colonial survival. A request was quietly sent, asking for naval advisors to help secure Singapore's vulnerable coastline. The response was even colder than India's. Nasser was the champion of pan-Arabism and Islamic solidarity. For him to send military aid to Lee Kuan Yew, a man viewed with deep suspicion by the Muslim populations of Malaysia and Indonesia, would have been political suicide. Nasser valued his standing in the Islamic world far more than the survival of a tiny city-state thousands of miles away. The rejection from Egypt confirmed Lee's worst fear. The religious and ethnic dynamics of the region had effectively quarantined Singapore. They were politically radioactive. In a final act of desperation, Singapore turned back to its former colonial master, Great Britain. The British were already there, staffing the bases and protecting the skies, but their commitment was waning. When Goh Keng Swee asked the British military command to help train a new Singaporean army that could operate independently, the British balked. They were willing to provide a shield, but they had no interest in handing Singapore a sword. The British logic was cynical but sound. If they trained a potent Singaporean offensive force, it might provoke the very war with Malaysia that Britain was trying to avoid. They wanted Singapore to remain dependent, a quiet outpost, not a militarized spark that could ignite the region. They offered vague promises of protection but refused to share the institutional knowledge of how to build a modern war machine. By late 1965, the verdict was clear. The Afro-Asian bloc had turned its back. The Commonwealth was indifferent. Singapore was not just alone, it was being actively shunned. It was in this vacuum of rejection that the forbidden thought began to take root in the minds of Lee Kuan Yew and Goh Keng Swee. For years, Lee had watched the state of Israel with a fascination that he dared not express in public. He saw in the Jewish state a terrifying parallel to his own situation. Israel was a tiny nation, devoid of natural resources, occupying a sliver of land that its neighbors claimed did not belong to it. It was surrounded by a hostile Arab sea that outnumbered it 50-1. It had been born in war, expelled from the good graces of its neighbors, and forced to fight for its right to exist from day one. And yet, against all logic, Israel had not only survived, it had thrived. It had humiliated the combined armies of the Arab world in 1948 and 1956. Lee Kuan Yew looked at the map of the Middle East and saw the map of Southeast Asia. He saw in Israel the only other shrimp in a world of whales that had learned how to be poisonous. He realized that the British, the Indians, and the Egyptians could not teach Singapore how to survive because they had never faced extinction. Only Israel understood the psychology of the besieged. The decision to reach out to Tel Aviv was fraught with peril. If the news leaked that Lee Kuan Yew was inviting Israeli military advisors into the heart of the Malay world, the consequences would be catastrophic. The Malaysian Prime Minister, Tunku Abdul Rahman, would view it as a Zionist incursion. The Indonesian generals would see it as a declaration of war. The radical elements within Singapore's own Malay community might rise up in revolt. It was a gamble that risked the immediate destruction of the state. But the alternative, remaining defenseless, was a guaranteed death sentence. Lee and Goh decided that it was better to be hated and alive than loved and dead. They had to move, and they had to move in the shadows. The contact was not made through official channels. There were no press releases, no summits, and no flags waving. Instead, a discreet message was sent to Bangkok, Thailand. At the time, Thailand was one of the few places in the region where Israel maintained a diplomatic presence. The message was delivered to Mordecai Kidron, the Israeli ambassador to Thailand. It was a humble request, devoid of the arrogance that often characterizes state-to-state relations. Singapore asked simply, "The world has turned us away. Will you help us?" For Israel, the request was a godsend wrapped in a mystery. The Jewish state was desperate to break out of its own diplomatic isolation. They were constantly looking for friends in the periphery, non-Arab nations that could serve as allies. Singapore, strategically located at the crossroads of world trade, offered Israel a foothold in Asia that it had never dreamed of. When the cable reached the Foreign Ministry and the Mossad headquarters in Tel Aviv, the response was swift. They recognized the strategic opportunity, but they also recognized the kinship of the underdog. The Israelis respected Lee Kuan Yew's tenacity. They saw in him a reflection of their own founding father, David Ben-Gurion, a secular pragmatist obsessed with survival. The reply came back from Bangkok with a speed that shocked the Singaporeans. Israel said, yes. They did not attach political conditions. They did not ask for public recognition. They understood the delicate sensitivities of the region better than anyone else. They agreed to send a team of their best military minds to build an army from the ground up, but they agreed to do it entirely in the dark. The pact was sealed not with a handshake in front of cameras, but with a quiet understanding between two pariah states. As 1965 drew to a close, the world assumed Singapore was drifting toward collapse, unaware that the most effective military machinery on the planet was about to be secretly shipped to the tropics. The desperation of rejection had birthed the most unlikely and dangerous alliance in modern Asian history. The decision to bring the Israelis into Singapore was made in the quiet, air-conditioned offices of the government, but the reality of that decision played out on a knife's edge, where the slightest slip could have resulted in a bloodbath. To understand the sheer lunacy and brilliance of the cover story, one must first appreciate the explosive demographics of Southeast Asia in 1965. The region was a powder keg of religious and ethnic tension. Singapore was a Chinese-majority island, trying to survive in a Malay-Muslim archipelago. The memories of the 1964 race riots, where Malays and Chinese had slaughtered each other in the streets, were still fresh, the blood hardly scrubbed from the pavement. The loyalty of the local Malay population was already strained, torn between their new country and their religious and ethnic brethren in Malaysia and Indonesia. Into this volatile mix, Lee Kuan Yew was about to introduce the one group of people guaranteed to ignite a holy war, the Zionists. If the news had leaked that the Singaporean government was inviting the Israeli Defense Forces, IDF, to train their military, the reaction would not have been a diplomatic protest, it would have been a jihad. The Malay press in Kuala Lumpur would have screamed that Singapore was becoming a beachhead for Israel in Asia. The fiery Sukarno in Indonesia would have used it as definitive proof that Singapore was a colonial puppet of the West and its Zionist lackeys. Within Singapore, the Malay regiments of the police and the military, the very men supposed to keep order, might have mutinied. Lee Kuan Yew and Goh Keng Swee were effectively sitting on a bomb, and by inviting the Israelis, they were playing with matches. Absolute secrecy was not just a preference, it was the only condition under which the state could survive the next 6 months. The operation began in earnest on Christmas Eve, 1965. It was a masterstroke of timing. The Western world was distracted by the holidays, the press corps was skeletal, and the airport traffic was chaotic. Under the cover of this festive distraction, a commercial flight touched down at Paya Lebar Airport. Stepping onto the tarmac into the suffocating tropical humidity was a small group of men who looked completely out of place. They were led by Colonel Yakov Jack Elazari, often referred to in the files as Jack Ullman. These were not the stiff, pale British officers that Singaporeans were accustomed to seeing. These men were bronzed, rugged, and carried themselves with a casual, predatory grace. They were Sabras, native-born Israelis, veterans of the 1948 and 1956 wars, men who had spent their entire adult lives fighting for the survival of a small desert state. Now they were in the tropics, tasked with saving another small state from extinction. But how do you hide a team of battle-hardened Jewish commanders in a city where everyone watches everyone? You cannot hide them physically. They have to go to the camps. They have to inspect the terrain. They have to eat. You have to hide them in plain sight. You need a lie that is big enough to be believed, boring enough to discourage questions, and exotic enough to explain why these men look and sound so different. The cover story concocted by Goh Keng Swee and the Ministry of Defense was a piece of creative genius born of desperation. They announced that the government, in its effort to modernize the nation's economy and self-sufficiency, had hired a team of agricultural consultants. And where were these experts from? They were not from Israel, they were from Mexico. The Mexican cover story was selected with a kind of cynical brilliance. To the average Singaporean in 1965, whether a Chinese street hawker, a Malay dock worker, or an Indian clerk, Mexico was a land of total mystery. It was a place seen only in Hollywood westerns. It was known for being hot, for having deserts, and for being somewhere on the other side of the world. It was plausible that Mexico, a developing nation, might have agricultural expertise relevant to the tropics. More importantly, almost no one in Singapore knew what a real Mexican looked like, and certainly no one knew what a real Mexican sounded like. The Israelis were swarthy, dark-haired, and spoke English with a heavy, guttural accent that was definitely foreign but unplaceable to the Asian ear. If they had claimed to be Italian or Greek, the deception might have unraveled, as there were small European communities in Singapore who might have spotted the fraud. But Mexican, it was a blank slate. And so, the bizarre theater began. In all official government correspondence classified top secret, the Israeli Defense Forces advisors were referred to simply as the Mexicans. When Colonel Ullman and his team were introduced to the few Singaporean officers cleared to meet them, they were presented as experts here to help cultivate the land, a dark euphemism for cultivating a killing machine. The Israelis, for their part, had to play along with this surreal charade. Men who had commanded tank battalions in the Sinai Desert found themselves nodding politely when introduced as soil experts. They had to suppress their natural behaviors. They could not speak Hebrew in public. They had to be careful about their dietary habits, though the lack of kosher food was easily explained away as a Mexican quirk. They had to purge their luggage of any Hebrew newspapers, labels, or family photos that could betray their origin. The daily reality of this deception was a high-wire act of tension and unintentional comedy. There were moments of heart-stopping danger, masked as social awkwardness. On several occasions, curious locals or British expatriates would try to engage the Mexicans in conversation about their homeland. What is the food like in Mexico City? Is it true about the bullfights? The Israelis, whose knowledge of Mexico was likely limited to what they had seen in movies, had to improvise vague, non-committal answers, often cutting conversations short with a gruffness that was interpreted as professional eccentricity. The language barrier was the greatest risk. When the Israelis argued amongst themselves, which they did often with the passionate, hand-waving intensity typical of their culture, they had to do so in hushed tones or behind closed doors. If a Malay officer had walked past a room and heard the guttural sounds of Semitic Hebrew, the game would have been up. The government went to extraordinary lengths to protect the secret. The Mexicans were housed in secluded bungalows, away from the prying eyes of the city center. Their movements were strictly controlled. They were driven directly to the military camps and directly back. They were forbidden from visiting the nightclubs or bars where alcohol might loosen tongues. For the Singaporean government officials in the know, the stress was unbearable. They were essentially smuggling a team of wolves into a sheep pen and hoping the sheep wouldn't notice the fangs. Every day that passed without a headline in a Malaysian newspaper exposing the Zionist plot was a victory. Yet despite the absurdity, the disguise worked. It worked because it relied on the cognitive dissonance of the observer. The idea that the Jewish state would send its best warriors to a tiny island in Southeast Asia was simply too far-fetched for the average person to imagine. The Mexican label provided a convenient mental box to categorize these strange, intense men. It allowed the British commanders, who were still technically in charge of Singapore's overall defense, to turn a blind eye. The British likely suspected something. They were not fools, and they knew military bearing when they saw it. But the Mexican cover gave them plausible deniability. They didn't have to report to London that Israelis were in the Commonwealth. They only had to report that Singapore was consulting with agriculturalists. Under this fragile umbrella of lies, the real work began. The Mexicans were not planting corn. They were planting the seeds of total war capability. Inside the secure perimeters of the camps, the charade dropped. The agricultural consultants became what they truly were, the most efficient military trainers on the planet. They looked at the ragtag group of Singaporean recruits, many of whom had never held a gun and culturally despised the idea of soldiering, and they saw the raw material for an army. But outside the gates, the fiction remained. Lee Kuan Yew would appear on television, talking about economic development and stability, while secretly meeting with Colonel Ullman to discuss tank warfare doctrines and conscription models. The lie of the Mexicans was the shield behind which the sword of Singapore was being forged. It was a deception born of necessity, a secret treaty written in invisible ink, proving that in the game of national survival, the truth is often the first casualty and the most dangerous weapon. The arrival of the Mexicans in the sweltering, mosquito-infested camps of Jurong marked the beginning of one of the most jarring and transformative social experiments in Asian history. It was a collision of two diametrically opposed worldviews, a friction so intense that it threatened to spark the very mutiny the government feared. On one side stood the Singaporean recruits and the handful of officers inherited from the British colonial system. They were products of a rigid, hierarchical society, deeply influenced by Confucian values and the British class system. In their world, the officer was a gentleman, distant and infallible. The subordinate was a servant who waited for orders. Silence was a sign of discipline, and questioning authority was a sign of insubordination. On the other side stood the Israelis. They were the children of the kibbutz and the survivors of the Holocaust. Their military doctrine was born in the chaos of 1948, where supplies were low and survival depended on chutzpah, a Yiddish term encompassing audacity, cheek, and a refusal to accept no for an answer. They did not care about polished boots or parade ground drills. They cared about aggression, improvisation, and winning at any cost. The first hurdle was the sheer logistical nightmare of translating the art of war. The Israelis had arrived with their own military manuals, the Torat HaLeshima, Doctrine of Battle, bound in blue covers and written in Hebrew. These were the sacred texts of the IDF, distilled from decades of urban combat and desert warfare. But to the Singaporeans they might as well have been written in Martian. There was no time to teach the Singaporeans Hebrew, and the Israelis' English was often rough and heavily accented. In a frantic, sweat-soaked effort that ran day and night, a team of bilingual officers sat in stifling rooms, translating the Hebrew manuals into English. But it was not a simple matter of word-for-word substitution. The concepts themselves were alien. How do you translate the Israeli concept of Rosh Gadol, literally big head, meaning taking responsibility and looking at the bigger picture, to a soldier whose entire life has been conditioned to keep his head down and follow the rules? The blue books of the IDF were slowly morphed into the green books of the Singapore Armed Forces, but the ink on the pages could not bridge the cultural chasm. The training ground became the crucible where this clash played out. The Israelis were horrified by the civil servant mentality of the Singaporean officers. They observed that when a plan failed during a training exercise, the Singaporeans would freeze, waiting for a senior officer to arrive and give new instructions. In Israel, a corporal would take command if the lieutenant fell. In Singapore, the chain of command was a paralysis. The Mexicans set about breaking this mindset with brutal efficiency. They introduced a training regimen that was physically punishing and psychologically demanding. They screamed, they pushed, and they mocked. They stripped the officers of their Batman servants, a British colonial relic where officers had soldiers to polish their shoes and make their tea. The Israelis were appalled by this class distinction. In the field, Colonel Jack Ullman barked, an officer eats last, an officer carries the heaviest load, an officer leads from the front. This was the doctrine of Aharai, follow me. To the shock of the Singaporean recruits, they saw these Mexican colonels jumping into the mud ditches alongside them, sweating, cursing, and eating the same meager rations. It shattered the colonial myth of the distant commander. However, this aggressive methodology birthed deep tensions. The Israelis, blunt and often culturally insensitive, initially viewed the locals with a mixture of frustration and condescension. In private, and sometimes carelessly in public, they referred to the Singaporeans as the Browns. It was a derogatory shorthand distinguishing the locals from the whites, the British, and themselves. It reflected the racial arrogance of the era, but also a frustration with what they perceived as the physical frailty of the urbanized Singaporeans. The Singaporeans, in turn, resented the harshness of these foreigners. They were proud men, many educated in the best English schools, being shouted at by men who looked like farmers and acted like thugs. There were moments in the mess halls where the silence was heavy with suppressed violence. The Singaporeans were kiasu, afraid to lose, afraid to fail, afraid to step out of line. The Israelis interpreted this caution as cowardice. The Singaporeans interpreted the Israeli aggression as bullying. The turning point came not through a speech, but through shared suffering. As the training intensified, moving into the live firing phase and the grueling jungle marches, the dynamic began to shift. The Israelis realized that while the Singaporeans lacked initiative, they possessed an immense capacity for endurance. They could march for days in humidity that made the Israelis faint. They absorbed knowledge with a voracious hunger. The Browns were not soft, they were simply waiting to be unlocked. Slowly, the nickname lost its venom and became a term of begrudging professional respect. The Singaporeans, for their part, began to see the method behind the madness. They realized that the Mexicans were teaching them how to stay alive. When an Israeli instructor showed them how to clear a room or ambush a convoy, it wasn't theoretical. It was blood-bought knowledge from the Sinai campaign. A bond began to form, forged in the mud of Pasir Laba. It was the birth of a new martial identity, a synthesis of Asian discipline and Israeli aggression. While the sergeants screamed in the mud, a quieter but more profound transformation was happening in the air-conditioned offices of the Ministry of Defense. This was the domain of Reuven Zeev, the head of the Mossad IDF mission and the true architect of the Singapore Armed Forces. Zeev was the Mexican who spent hours with Lee Kuan Yew and Goh Keng Swee, staring at maps and demographic charts. He was the one who delivered the hard truths that no one else dared to speak. Zeev told Lee Kuan Yew bluntly, "You cannot afford a professional army. You are too small, you have no people." He laid out the blueprint for the only model that could save them, the citizen army. He explained the concept of national service, not just as a military necessity, but as a nation-building tool. Zeev argued that in a country divided by race, Chinese, Malay, Indian, the army had to be the melting pot. He helped design the conscription laws that would force the son of a millionaire banker to dig trenches alongside the son of a hawker. He meticulously planned the order of battle, structuring the army into active units and reservist brigades that could be mobilized in hours. This was the poison shrimp doctrine taking physical form. Zeev and his team designed the logistics, the supply chains, and the mobilization depots. They essentially downloaded the brain of the Israeli military into the hard drive of the Singaporean state. These meetings were intense intellectual duels. Lee Kuan Yew, ever the skeptic, questioned every detail, and Zeev, true to his chutzpah, pushed back, refusing to sugarcoat the vulnerabilities. By the time the first batch of officers graduated from the Singapore Armed Forces Training Institute, SAFTI, the culture shock had produced something entirely unique. The parade was flawless, a nod to the British tradition of drill, but the men standing in formation were different. They were no longer colonial subjects waiting for orders. They were aggressive, tactical thinkers who understood that they were fighting with their backs to the sea. The Mexicans stood in the background, hidden from the cameras, watching their creation. They had arrived as strangers, masking their identity, mocking the locals as Browns. They were leaving as the secret godfathers of a military machine that would soon become the most feared in Southeast Asia. They had translated the Hebrew spirit of survival into the Asian context, proving that, while culture runs deep, the will to survive runs deeper. The Kiasu fear of failure had been weaponized. Now the Singaporeans were terrified of failing to defend their home, and that fear made them dangerous. The blueprint for Singapore's survival was drawn not on a grand strategic map of the region, but on the back of a demographic napkin. As the Mexican advisors sat down with Lee Kuan Yew and Goh Keng Swee in the stark, confidential rooms of the Ministry of the Interior and Defense, the math was terrifyingly simple. Singapore had a population of roughly 2 million people. Indonesia had over 100 million. Malaysia had 10 million. To build a standing professional army large enough to repel an invasion from either neighbor was an economic and demographic impossibility. A large professional force would drain the treasury, stripping funds from education and housing, and it would pull the most productive young men out of the workforce, collapsing the very economy they were trying to build. Singapore was trapped in a paradox. It needed a massive army to survive, but building one would destroy the nation from within. It was here that Reuven Zeev and the Israeli team played their most critical card. They introduced the Singaporean leadership to the concept of the citizen soldier, the bedrock of the Israeli defense forces. In Israel, defense was not a career choice. It was a condition of citizenship. The barber, the banker, the teacher, and the politician were all soldiers first. They served 2 or 3 years of full-time duty and then returned to civilian life, remaining in the reserves until middle age. In the event of war, a single code word broadcast over the radio could mobilize the entire male population in 24 hours, transforming a small nation into a regional superpower overnight. However, transposing the Israeli model to Singapore required more than just legislation. It required a fundamental rewiring of the Chinese soul. For thousands of years, Confucian culture had placed the soldier at the very bottom of the social hierarchy. The scholar was at the top, followed by the farmer, the artisan, and the merchant. The soldier was seen as a failed man, a bandit in uniform, a brute who could not succeed in civil society. There was a proverb deeply ingrained in the psyche of every Chinese grandmother in Singapore. Good iron is not made into nails, and good men are not made into soldiers. To the average Singaporean family, sending a son to the army was a tragedy, a sign that he had no future. Lee Kuan Yew knew that if he could not break this cultural stigma, the hardware and the training would mean nothing. He had to convince a nation of merchants that the rifle was as noble as the pen. The campaign to introduce national service in 1967 was a masterclass in psychological engineering. Lee Kuan Yew and his cabinet did not apologize for the draft. They framed it as a rite of passage, a blood tax for the privilege of citizenship. They launched a relentless propaganda campaign to create the image of the rugged society. They needed to turn the softness of the urban population into a virtue, arguing that discipline and physical toughness were the keys not just to survival, but to economic success. To prove that this was not a burden for the poor alone, the government made a point of enlisting the sons of the elite. There were no exemptions for wealth or status. When the first batch of national servicemen, the ethos of the nation, marched into the camps, they were a cross-section of society. But the anxiety was palpable. Mothers wept at the gates of the camps as if they were sending their sons to the executioner. The Mexicans, watching from the shadows, knew that the success of the entire project hung on these first few months. If the boys broke, if the public turned against the draft, the defense of Singapore would collapse. It was in this crucible that the strategic doctrine of the poisonous shrimp was born. This was the philosophy that would guide the Singapore armed forces for decades, a concept refined in late-night sessions between Lee Kuan Yew and his Israeli mentors. The logic was cold and biological. Singapore, by virtue of its size, could never be a tiger or a bear. It would always be prey in a jungle of predators. A shrimp is small, it is tasty, it is easily swallowed by a larger fish. But there are species of shrimp in nature that are toxic. If a fish swallows one, it suffers such agonizing pain or internal damage that it dies or is forced to spit it out. The goal of the Singapore Armed Forces was not necessarily to win a long, drawn-out war against a giant like Indonesia. That was physically impossible. The goal was deterrence through the guarantee of mutual agony. The doctrine stated that Singapore must be strong enough that any aggressor who attempted to invade would suffer such catastrophic losses that the conquest would be worthless. "You may swallow us," the doctrine effectively said, "but we will tear your insides out on the way down." To make the shrimp poisonous, however, required venom. You cannot deter a tank with a bamboo spear, and you cannot scare a destroyer with a fishing boat. The British had left Singapore with almost nothing in terms of heavy weaponry. No tanks, no fighter jets, no heavy artillery. They had deliberately kept the island demilitarized to avoid provoking the neighbors. Now, Singapore had to arm itself to the teeth, and it had to do so in total secrecy. If Malaysia or Indonesia caught wind that Singapore was buying heavy offensive weaponry, they might launch a preemptive strike before the packages could be opened. Once again, the Mexicans opened the door to the armories of the West. Israel became the conduit for high-grade military hardware that Singapore officially had no business owning. The most audacious component of this secret rearmament was the acquisition of the AMX-13 light tanks. At the time, the conventional wisdom was that tanks were useless in the tropics. The British had argued that the jungle terrain, the marshy ground, and the countless rivers of Southeast Asia made armored warfare impossible. They claimed tanks would sink in the mud or get stuck on the narrow rubber plantation roads. The Israelis, however, looked at the terrain differently. They knew that the AMX-13, a French-made light tank, was agile, fast, and light enough to traverse the bridges of Malaysia. More importantly, they knew that the psychological impact of a tank is devastating. An infantryman with a rifle feels brave until he hears the rumble of treads and the mechanical whine of a traversing turret. The purchase was a clandestine operation worthy of a spy novel. In 1968, dozens of these tanks were purchased, ostensibly as agricultural machinery or heavy construction equipment routed through front companies and complex shipping manifests. When they arrived at the docks in Singapore, they were unloaded at night under heavy guard and driven immediately into hidden hangars. The Mexicans began training the first generation of Singaporean tank crews in absolute isolation. These young men, many of whom didn't even have a driver's license, were suddenly sitting inside 15 tons of steel, learning how to fire high-explosive shells. They were the secret venom of the shrimp. While the Malaysian generals slept soundly, confident that Singapore was a defenseless island of clerks, deep in the forests of the catchment area, the ground was shaking under the treads of an armored division that officially did not exist. At the same time, the infantry was being upgraded with the mesmerizing firepower of the AR-15 rifle, the precursor to the M16. At a time when most regional armies were still using heavy bolt-action rifles or outdated semi-automatics from World War II, the Israelis advised Singapore to leapfrog straight to the cutting edge of assault rifle technology. The AR-15 was lightweight, plastic, and fired a small high-velocity round that caused devastating wounds. It was perfect for the smaller stature of the Asian conscript. The deal to buy these rifles was controversial. The weapon was new and relatively untested in large-scale warfare, but the Israelis insisted on firepower dominance. Every Singaporean soldier, they argued, must be able to put more lead in the air than his opponent. This was the force multiplier effect. One Singaporean soldier with an AR-15 was worth 3 enemies with bolt-action rifles. As the months turned into years, the transformation took hold. The weeping mothers at the gates were replaced by proud families, attending passing-out parades. The awkward, terrified boys who had entered the camps emerged as hardened reservists, confident in their ability to handle lethal weapons. The cultural stigma began to crack. The Mexicans had done more than teach tactics. They had instilled a sense of elite purpose. They had proven that the soft traders of the port city could be forged into a mechanism of lethal efficiency. The poisonous shrimp was growing its shell. The island was no longer naked. It was bristling with hidden thorns, waiting for the day it would have to reveal its true nature to the world. The doctrine was set, the weapons were oiled in the dark, and the Mexicans watched with grim satisfaction as their students surpassed the master, ready to turn the strategic map of Southeast Asia upside down. By 1967, the Mexican charade had held for 2 years, a miraculous feat of operational security in a city that thrived on gossip. However, the laws of probability were beginning to assert themselves against the Singaporean government. You can hide a handful of men for a week. Hiding a military training mission of dozens of officers and their families for years in a densely populated island nation is a task that borders on the impossible. The secrecy that enveloped the Israeli mission began to fray at the edges, not because of a single catastrophic leak, but through the slow, corrosive drip of observation. Singapore is a small place. It is a society where everyone is connected by a web of family and clan associations. People talk in the coffee shops. Taxi drivers notice strange passengers. Hawkers see who enters and leaves restricted areas. The Mexicans were disciplined, but they were human. They were seen driving military jeeps into the restricted sectors of the Jurong jungle. They were spotted observing drills from a distance, their posture too erect, their gaze too sharp to be that of agricultural scientists. The anomaly was becoming too obvious to ignore. Why did a team of soil experts spend all their time in army camps, and why did they never visit the farms? The whispers began to drift across the causeway into Malaysia, finding fertile ground in the newsrooms of Kuala Lumpur. The Malaysian press, particularly the Malay-language newspaper Utusan Melayu, had always viewed Lee Kuan Yew's government with deep suspicion, seeing Singapore as a bastion of Chinese chauvinism that threatened the Malay sphere of influence. Reporters began to ask uncomfortable questions. They published speculative pieces about mystery white men advising the Singaporean military. They poked holes in the Mexican cover story, noting that there was no record of any agricultural aid agreement between Mexico City and Singapore. The rumors were dangerous, not because they were accurate, but because of the narrative they fed. The story being spun in the kampongs of Malaysia was that Lee Kuan Yew was hiring mercenaries, or worse, that he was aligning with Western imperialist powers to threaten the Muslim world. The specter of the Zionist connection hovered like a dark cloud just out of sight. If a journalist managed to snap a photo of a Mexican reading a Hebrew newspaper, or if a discarded letter was found, the geopolitical explosion would be instantaneous. Inside the Singaporean government, the tension was suffocating. Lee Kuan Yew lived in a state of perpetual vigilance. He knew that the revelation of the Israeli presence would not just cause a diplomatic row, it could trigger an invasion. The Malaysian armed forces were vastly superior in numbers and equipment, and the presence of Israelis could provide the casus belli, the justification for war that the hawks in Kuala Lumpur were looking for. They could frame an invasion not as an act of aggression, but as a rescue mission to save the region from Zionist infiltration. To prevent this, Lee imposed a regime of draconian isolation on the Israelis. They became prisoners of their own success. They were strictly forbidden from attending official state functions, diplomatic receptions, or even public social gatherings where foreign diplomats might be present. While the British, Australian, and New Zealand officers stationed in Singapore enjoyed the high life of the Raffles Hotel and the Tanglin Club, the Israelis were ghosts. This enforced invisibility took a heavy psychological toll. The Israeli advisors were proud men, officers of a victorious army who were used to walking with their heads high. In Singapore, they were treated like a shameful secret. They had to endure the indignity of hiding in the kitchen or leaving through the back door. If a Malaysian dignitary visited a base they were inspecting, they had to watch as credit for their work was given to local ingenuity or vague international advisors. Reuven Zeev and Colonel Ullman understood the necessity of the deception, but it grated on them. They were building the sword that would save the nation, yet the nation could not acknowledge their existence. The stress was compounded by the fear of physical danger. The Israelis knew they were operating in hostile territory. If their identities were compromised, they would become prime targets for assassination by radical groups or Indonesian intelligence agents. They slept with guns near their beds, not because they feared the Singaporeans, but because they knew that in the world of shadows they were high-value targets. But the greatest danger to the project did not come from the Israelis or the Malaysian press. It came from the internal demographics of Singapore itself. The implementation of national service, the draft, forced the government to confront the elephant in the room, the loyalty of the Malay Muslim population. In 1967, Malays made up about 15% of the population of Singapore. They were the indigenous people of the region, sharing a religion and culture with the potential enemies in Malaysia and Indonesia. Lee Kuan Yew and Goh Keng Swee faced a nightmarish dilemma. If they drafted Malays into the army and trained them with modern weapons, they risked creating a fifth column. In the event of a war with Malaysia, would a Malay Singaporean soldier fire on his brother across the border, or would he turn his rifle on his Chinese officer? The memories of the 1964 race riots were a trauma that had not healed. During those riots, Malay soldiers and policemen had sometimes stood by or even aided the rioters. The trust was broken. On the other hand, if the government excluded Malays from the draft, it would give the lie to the entire narrative of One Singapore. It would officially brand the Malay community as second-class citizens, untrustworthy and disloyal. It would deepen the racial divide and provide ammunition to the critics who claimed Singapore was a third China. It was a choice between security and ideology, and in the hard-hearted calculus of 1960s Singapore, security won. Under the quiet but firm advice of the Israeli advisors, who understood the dangers of internal subversion better than anyone, the government made the agonizing decision to exclude Malays from the sensitive combat units of the new army. When the first call-up letters for national service were sent out, the pattern became obvious. Chinese and Indian boys were called up to the infantry, armor, and artillery units. Malay boys were either not called up at all, or they were shunted into the police force and the fire brigade. The test of loyalty was a silent policy, never officially written down in public laws, but brutally effective in practice. The reaction in the Malay community was one of hurt and anger. They felt the sting of rejection. They were citizens of Singapore, yet the state did not trust them with a gun. Rumors flew through the bazaars that the government was building a Chinese army to oppress the minorities. The tension in the streets rose. Every time a truckload of Chinese recruits drove past a Malay kampong, the visual disparity was a reminder of the fracture in society. Lee Kuan Yew had to navigate this minefield with nerves of steel. He could not admit why the Malays were being excluded, for that would be an open admission of the Trojan horse fear, which would only incite further hatred. He had to use vague bureaucratic excuses, claiming administrative phased implementation or manpower allocation. Behind closed doors, the anxiety was palpable. The government feared that the Malay battalions of the old colonial army, which were still being phased out, might mutiny when they realized they were being replaced by a conscript force that excluded their kin. The Mexicans advised total segregation of the new units from the old ones to prevent contamination. They treated the situation as a potential civil war in the making. This was the darkest period of the military build-up. The secret of the Israelis was leaking from the outside, and the fabric of racial unity was tearing from the inside. The government was juggling a lie to the world and a painful truth to its own people. Every day brought the risk of a spark, a newspaper headline in Kuala Lumpur revealing the Zionists, or a racial brawl in a barracks in Singapore that could ignite the powder keg. The survival of Singapore hung by a thread, suspended between the deception of its friends and the distrust of its own citizens. It was a high-stakes game of poker, played with human lives, where the only way to win was to keep a straight face while the table burned. August 9, 1969, was destined to be a turning point in the history of Southeast Asia, though few in the crowds gathering along St. Andrew's Road realized that they were about to witness a geopolitical reveal of seismic proportions. It was the 150th anniversary of the founding of modern Singapore by Stamford Raffles, and the fourth national day since the traumatic separation from Malaysia. The atmosphere in the city was electric, charged with a mixture of patriotic fervor and the lingering anxiety of a people who still felt vulnerable. For 4 years, the government had preached the gospel of the rugged society, demanding sacrifice, discipline, and silence from its citizens. They had conscripted the sons of the nation, taken them into the jungles, and hidden them away behind the fences of restricted camps. Rumors had swirled, gossip had festered, but no one, not the average Singaporean, and certainly not the foreign military attachés sitting in the VIP stands, knew the true extent of what had been built in the dark. Lee Kuan Yew and Goh Keng Swee had decided that the time for secrecy was over. The era of the Mexican masquerade had served its purpose. It was time to pull back the curtain and show the world that the shrimp had grown its shell. The parade began with the usual fanfare, marching bands, school children, and labor unions. But as the morning progressed, a low, mechanical rumble began to vibrate through the soles of the spectators' shoes, a sound distinct from the rhythmic stomp of boots. It was the grinding, metallic roar of heavy machinery. Then, rounding the corner past City Hall, the nightmare of Singapore's neighbours rolled into view. It was a mobile column, the first in the nation's history. But these were not the soft-skinned Land Rovers or the outdated trucks left behind by the British. Leading the formation were columns of AMX-13 light tanks, their 75mm guns pointing skyward, their tracks chewing up the colonial asphalt. Behind them came the V-200 armoured personnel carriers, bristling with machine guns, followed by mortars and recoilless rifles mounted on jeeps. The shock in the VIP stands was palpable. The military attachés from Malaysia and Indonesia froze. For years, their intelligence assessments had described Singapore as a defenseless island, a soft target that could be overrun in a matter of hours by a determined infantry push. They believed Singapore possessed only a few rifles and a demoralized police force. Now staring them in the face was a mechanized armored division. The AMX-13 was the perfect predator for the region, light enough to cross the fragile bridges of the Malay Peninsula, yet holding enough firepower to destroy any vehicle in the Malaysian inventory. The visual impact was devastating. It was an instant obsolescence of all previous military calculations. The question racing through the minds of the foreign observers was not just where did they get them, but who taught them how to use them. Tanks are not like rifles. You cannot hand a tank to a conscript and expect him to operate it effectively in a few months. Armored warfare requires complex logistics, intricate communication, and a tactical aggression that takes years to master. The precision with which the Singaporean crews drove their machines, the spacing, the discipline, the sheer professionalism, betrayed a lineage of high-level instruction. As the tanks rumbled past Lee Kuan Yew, who stood on the dais, saluting with a grim, unsmiling face, the penny dropped for the intelligence agencies of the Muslim world. No British instructor would teach an offensive armoured doctrine to Singapore. No Indian or Egyptian advisor had been present. There was only one military in the world that specialized in rapid, aggressive tank warfare using French equipment: Israel. The appearance of the tanks confirmed the whispers that had been circulating for years. The agricultural advisors, the Mexicans, the strange white men seen in the jungles, it all clicked into place. The realization was a cold bucket of water for the region's hawks. The presence of Israeli-trained armor meant that Singapore had not just built a defense force. It had adopted the Israeli doctrine of the preemptive strike. It meant that if Malaysia or Indonesia threatened war, Singapore now had the capability to push north, to take the fight to the enemy's territory, rather than waiting to be slaughtered on the island. The poisonous shrimp was no longer a theoretical concept discussed in cabinet meetings. It was rolling down the street, clad in steel and diesel fumes. The psychological impact of the 1969 parade changed the diplomatic temperature of Southeast Asia overnight. The rhetoric from Kuala Lumpur and Jakarta, which had often been bullying and threatening, began to shift. The threats of crushing Singapore evaporated, replaced by a wary, begrudging respect. Nations do not bully porcupines. They leave them alone. The parade achieved exactly what Lee Kuan Yew had intended: deterrence without firing a shot. By revealing the weapon, he ensured he would never have to use it. The Mexican cover story, having outlived its usefulness, was allowed to slowly wither away. While the government did not hold a press conference to officially announce it was the Mossad, the pretense was dropped. Lee Kuan Yew later admitted in his memoirs and interviews that the Mexicans were indeed Israelis, acknowledging the debt the nation owed to the Jewish state. The unraveling of the secret did not lead to the holy war that the government had feared in 1965. The timing had been perfect. In 1965, the revelation might have caused an invasion because Singapore was weak. In 1969, the revelation prevented an invasion because Singapore was strong. The neighbors were angry, yes, and there were diplomatic protests, but they were impotent. They could not invade a country that could fight back with such ferocity. The Israeli mission had succeeded in its ultimate goal. They had made themselves obsolete. They had transferred their knowledge, their doctrine, and their spirit to a new generation of Singaporean officers. As the tanks disappeared into the distance and the roar of the crowd washed over the Padang, it was clear that the umbilical cord had been cut. Singapore was no longer an orphan pleading for help. It was a fortress, built by the audacity of a few men who dared to lie to the world in order to save their home. The masquerade was over, and the Lion City had finally earned its claws. Decades have passed since the last of the Mexicans packed their bags and quietly slipped out of Changi Airport. Their mission accomplished, their identities still officially shrouded in the mist of diplomatic ambiguity. Today, the Singapore Armed Forces, SAF, bears little resemblance to the ragtag group of frightened conscripts who marched in the mud of Jurong in 1966. It has evolved into the Israel of the East, a military machine that is widely considered the most technologically advanced and lethal fighting force in Southeast Asia. The transformation is absolute. The poisonous shrimp has evolved into something far more dangerous, a high-tech porcupine bristling with sensors, drones, and precision-guided munitions that can strike enemies long before they even cross the horizon. While its neighbors, Malaysia and Indonesia, still possess vast advantages in population and landmass, the balance of power has fundamentally shifted. In a modern conflict, mass is no match for mastery. Singapore's Air Force dominates the skies with American and Israeli technology. Its Navy patrols the straits with submarines that run silent and deep, and its army operates as a fully networked digital force. The deterrent is no longer a bluff. It is a cold, hard fact of Asian geopolitics that ensures the city-state is treated not as a refugee camp, but as a fortress. The legacy of that desperate Christmas in 1965 lives on in the deep, unshakable bond between Singapore and Israel. It is a special relationship that remains one of the most intriguing open secrets in international relations. While Singapore has normalized relations with its Muslim neighbors and maintains a delicate diplomatic dance to avoid unnecessary provocation, the umbilical cord to Tel Aviv has never truly been cut. It has simply matured. The relationship shifted from basic training to the bleeding edge of military technology. Today, Singapore is a premier client for Israeli defense contractors, purchasing and jointly developing radar systems, anti-ship missiles, and unmanned aerial vehicles. The visual cues are there for those who know where to look. The ethos of the SAF, the obsession with readiness, the reliance on conscription, and the doctrine of the preemptive strike, is a direct genetic inheritance from the IDF. The Mexicans did not just leave behind manuals, they left behind a mindset. They taught a nation of traders that in a world of wolves, wealth is meaningless without the steel to defend it. For Lee Kuan Yew, the success of the Israeli mission was the ultimate vindication of his ruthless pragmatism. In his later years, as the elder statesman of Asia, he would reflect on those early days with a mixture of relief and gratitude. The lesson he drew from the experience was stark and unsentimental. When Singapore was on its knees, facing the very real prospect of annihilation, the civilized world turned away. The British were too tired, the Indians were too cautious, and the Egyptians were too bound by religious solidarity. The great liberal democracies offered sympathy, but they did not offer survival. Only Israel, another pariah state, another tiny dot surrounded by hostility, reached out a hand. Lee Kuan Yew never forgot that. He understood that survival is not a popularity contest. It is not about doing what is politically correct. It is about doing what is necessary. The decision to invite the Israelis was the most dangerous gamble of his career. If it had failed, it would have destroyed him. But because it succeeded, it saved his country. The story of the Mexicans serves as a permanent reminder of the fragility of independence. It strips away the pomp and ceremony of statehood to reveal the raw mechanics of power. It teaches that a nation's right to exist is not guaranteed by the United Nations or international law, but by its own ability to inflict pain on those who would destroy it. The deception was a necessary lie, a mask worn to buy time, until the face behind it was strong enough to stare down the world. Today, when young Singaporean men enlist for their national service, shaving their heads and picking up their rifles, they are participating in a ritual designed by a ghost team of commanders from the other side of the world. They are the living legacy of a secret treaty forged in desperation. The agricultural consultants may be long gone, but the harvest they planted is a sovereign, independent, and unconquerable Singapore. The world said no, Israel said yes, and because of a daring lie about Mexican farmers, the Lion City survived to roar.